Revenge is a dish best served cold, but no one tells you about the years you have to spend in the freezer, forging the plate. They don't tell you that to serve it right, you have to become the ice. For 10 years, I let the world think I had forgotten. I let him think I was a ghost, a footnote in his triumphant story. But I wasn't gone. I was just learning a new language, the language of power, written in zeros and commas. And today, I was finally ready to have a conversation he would understand. The story you're about to hear is about the long, quiet, and meticulous art of taking back what's yours. It's for anyone who has ever been underestimated, betrayed, and had their future stolen right out from under them. If you believe that the most satisfying justice is the kind you build yourself, brick by painful brick, then do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and settle in. Because the wolves are about to find out what happens when the sheep they devoured was actually a predator in disguise. Part 1. The Gilded Cage and the Stolen Spark. It all began with the smell of old leather and single malt scotch. That was the scent of Richard Dalton's study, a room that felt less like a part of a home and more like a corporate cathedral. Heavy mahogany desk, walls lined with books he'd never read, and a window that overlooked a city he felt he owned. I was 24, fresh out of business school with a fire in my belly and a concept I believed could change the world. Or, at the very least, a small part of it. I was in that study because I was in love with his son, Mark. Mark was gentle. Where his father was a storm, Mark was a quiet harbor. He saw the passion in my eyes when I talked about my final thesis project, a line of fully biodegradable, plant-based packaging derived from agricultural waste. It wasn't just eco-friendly, it was cost-effective, strong, and beautiful. It was my baby. My ticket to a future I was designing myself. Mark had insisted I present it to his father. "He'll love it, Emmy," he'd said, his eyes wide with earnest belief. "He's always looking for the next big thing. He can help you. He can be your mentor." A mentor. The word hung in the air, glittering with promise. Richard Dalton, the titan of industry, head of the sprawling Dalton Industries, taking me under his wing. It felt like a dream. That night, I stood before him, my presentation loaded onto a tablet, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I remember the way the light glinted off his perfectly polished shoes. He sat back in his throne-like chair, swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass. "All right, Emily," he began, already getting my name wrong. It was a subtle power play, the first of many. "Mark tells me you have an idea that's going to save the world." His lips curled into a smile that didn't touch his cold, calculating eyes. It was the smile of a man who'd seen 1,000 bright-eyed idealists and crushed every single one of them. I ignored the tremor in my hands and began. I spoke about the market gap, the consumer shift towards sustainability, the science behind the material composition. I laid out the 5-year business plan, the production logistics, the branding strategy. I poured every ounce of my soul, my research, and my ambition onto the glossy surface of that mahogany desk. For 45 minutes, I wasn't just a student. I was a founder, a CEO, a visionary. When I finished, the room was silent, save for the faint clink of ice against glass. Richard stared at me, his expression unreadable. My throat was dry. "Impressive," he said finally, the word landing flat and heavy. "Very thorough. You've put a lot of thought into this." He leaned forward, placing his glass down with a decisive thud. "But you're thinking too small, kid. A standalone startup? You'll be eaten alive. The supply chain alone will bankrupt you before you sell your first unit." My hopeful expression must have faltered. I have projections for that. With initial seed funding." He waved a dismissive hand. "Projections are fairy tales we tell investors. Reality is a street fight. What this idea needs is scale. It needs the muscle of an established infrastructure." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It needs Dalton Industries." My heart leaped. Are you offering to invest? He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Something like that. Let me look over this proposal. Mull it over. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Emily. A little naive, but the raw material is there. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Leave the tablet with me. I'll have my team do some due diligence. Mark was ecstatic. He wrapped me in a hug the moment we were out of the room, whispering, I told you. He sees it. You're in, Emmy, you're really in. I let myself believe him. I handed over my entire life's work, the research, the branding, the financial models, everything, on a silver platter, believing I was gaining a partner, a mentor. The next 2 weeks were a blur of hopeful excitement. I imagined the labs, the product launch, seeing my creation on shelves. Mark and I celebrated, talking about our future, a future that was now inextricably linked with his family's empire. I was so blinded by the dazzling light of what could be, I didn't see the shadow creeping up behind me. The call didn't come. Neither did an email. A month went by. Then 2. My messages to Richard's office went unanswered. Mark kept making excuses. He's in Singapore. He's closing a massive merger. He's just busy, Emmy. You know how he is. Big things take time. But a pit of dread was forming in my stomach, cold and heavy. I started to feel like a fool. The silence wasn't the sound of deliberation. It was the sound of a door being quietly, firmly locked. The confirmation came on a Tuesday morning. I was scrolling through a business news feed while sipping my coffee. And there it was. A headline that made the ceramic mug slip from my fingers and shatter on the floor. Dalton Industries unveils Terraflex, the future of sustainable packaging. My blood ran cold. I clicked the link, my hand shaking so violently I could barely control the mouse. The article was accompanied by a picture of Richard Dalton, standing on a stage, beaming, holding a sleek, green box. My box. The article quoted him extensively. He talked about his vision for a greener tomorrow, how this idea had come to him as an epiphany, a way for his company to pivot and lead the charge in corporate responsibility. He used my phrases. My data. He even used the tagline I had workshopped for weeks, packaging the planet can live with. It was my soul, stripped for parts and rebranded with his name. I couldn't breathe. The air in my tiny apartment felt thick, suffocating. I stumbled back from the computer, a strangled sob escaping my lips. It wasn't just theft. It was erasure. He hadn't just stolen my idea. He had stolen my entire identity as its creator. I called Mark, my voice a frantic, broken whisper. Did you see it? Mark, did you see the news? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A heavy, damning silence. Emmy, he started, his voice strained. Dad was going to tell you. Tell me what? I shrieked, the tears finally breaking free. That he stole my entire life's work? That he's parading it around as his own? Did you know, Mark? Did you know this was happening? More silence. And in that silence, I heard everything. I heard his weakness, his cowardice, his choice. He had chosen his father. He had chosen the money, the power, the name. He had chosen to stand by and watch as my future was ripped away from me. He said it was for the best, Mark finally mumbled, his words pathetic and hollow. He said the idea was too big for you, that it needed the Dalton name to succeed. He's going to give you a finder's fee, Emmy. A generous one. He said it's just business. Just business. The 2 words that psychopaths use to justify gutting you in broad daylight. A finder's fee. A pittance thrown to the girl whose mind he'd plundered. It was the ultimate insult. He wasn't just a thief. He was telling me my contribution was worth nothing more than a cheap payoff. I hung up. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. A terrifying calm washed over me, the kind that follows a catastrophic explosion. The world had gone quiet. The love I felt for Mark, the respect I had for his father, the hope I had for my future, it all curdled into something cold and hard and sharp in the center of my chest. That evening, I drove to the Dalton estate. I didn't call. I didn't ask for permission. The security guard at the gate knew my car and let me through. I found Richard in that same study, a cigar in his hand, celebrating his triumph. He looked up when I entered, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Emily, this isn't a good time." "Don't call me that," I said, my voice dangerously low. "My name is Emmy." He sighed, taking a long drag from his cigar. "Look, I understand you're upset. Mark said you would be. But you need to be realistic. You couldn't have done what I did today. You don't have the clout, the capital, the connections. I took your little school project and I made it real. You should be thanking me." The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it stole my breath. He genuinely believed he was the hero of this story. "You're a thief," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate to describe the scale of his monstrosity. He just smiled that cold, dead smile. "It's called an acquisition. I acquired an asset. That asset was an idea, and the idea happened to be in your head. It's business. You'll get your check tomorrow. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux I plan on opening." He turned his back on me, dismissing me as if I were a fly buzzing in his ear. I stood there for a long moment, watching the silhouette of the man who had hollowed me out. In that moment, I realized that fighting him head-on was pointless. He was a fortress. You don't beat a fortress by banging on its gates. You beat it by collapsing it from within, stone by stone, until the king is buried in the rubble of his own castle. As I walked out of that house, leaving my relationship, my project, and my old self behind, a new resolve began to harden in my veins. He thought I was a naive kid with a school project. He thought a check could silence me. He thought he had won. But I knew something he didn't. He had stolen my idea, but he had given me something far more valuable in return, a purpose. He had taught me the most important lesson of my life. That power wasn't about having the best ideas. It was about having the leverage to make them your reality. And I would spend every waking moment of the rest of my life acquiring it. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Part 2. The Forging of a Ghost. The days that followed were a descent. I deferred my graduation, I stopped answering calls, and I moved out of my apartment into a shabby little studio across town, a place where the ghosts of my ambition couldn't find me. The check from Dalton Industries arrived via courier. $50,000. I remember staring at the number, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. $50,000 for a concept that would generate hundreds of millions. It wasn't a payment, it was a gag order. It was the price of my silence. I ripped it into 1,000 tiny pieces and let them fall into the trash like confetti at a funeral. For months, I was adrift in a sea of my own failure. Every time I saw a Dalton Industries truck, or heard Richard's name on a financial news program, it was like a physical blow, reopening the wound. Terraflex was a massive success. It was lauded as a triumph of corporate innovation and responsibility. Richard Dalton was on the cover of magazines, hailed as a visionary. And I was no one, a ghost haunting a life that should have been mine. My nights were sleepless, filled with a phantom sensation of my heart pounding in my chest as I stood in his study, the replayed loop of his condescending voice, the image of Mark's silent betrayal. The grief was suffocating, but underneath it, something else was beginning to fester, rage. A cold, quiet, patient rage. It was the only thing that kept me warm during that long, brutal winter. I realized that sorrow was a passive emotion. It was a cage. Rage, on the other hand, was fuel. My life had been defined by creativity, by the desire to build something new. Richard Dalton had perverted that. He had taught me that in his world, builders were just prey for the takers. So, I made a decision. I wouldn't build something new. Not yet. First, I had to learn how to take. I had to learn the language he spoke, the brutal, beautiful, unforgiving language of money. I left the city without a word to anyone. I moved to Chicago, a city of steel and wind, a place where no one knew my name or the story of my humiliation. I enrolled in a master's program in finance, not out of passion, but out of necessity. It was my armory, my training ground. The first year was hell. I was surrounded by hungry, sharp-edged prodigies who had been breathing the air of Wall Street since they were in prep school. I was the soft-skinned idealist who'd once thought a good idea was enough. I lived in the library, fueled by cheap coffee and pure spite. I read about leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, proxy battles, and dark pools. I learned how fortunes were won and lost not in headlines, but in the fine print of SEC filings and the whispers between hedge fund managers. I learned that the stock market wasn't a reflection of value, it was a battlefield of perception, fear, and greed. My professors saw my obsessive drive as academic ambition. They didn't see the ghost of Richard Dalton standing over my shoulder, whispering, "This is the language I speak. Are you fluent yet?" After graduation, I didn't aim for the big, glamorous investment banks. They were too loud, too visible. I needed to remain a ghost. I took a job at a small, ruthless private equity firm that specialized in corporate restructuring. My boss was a man named Arthur Vance, a shark in a tailored suit with eyes that could spot a weak balance sheet from a mile away. He was a miserable human being, but he was a brilliant predator. And I became his prize student. Arthur taught me how to dissect a company, how to find the rot beneath the glossy annual reports, how to identify overpaid, underperforming executives, inefficient supply chains, and bloated legacy departments. He taught me to see a company not as a living entity, but as a collection of assets to be stripped, repurposed, or sold. It was a brutal education, and every lesson felt like a small piece of my old idealistic self being carved away. But with each piece I lost, I gained something harder, sharper, in its place. For 5 years, I worked for Arthur. I moved from Chicago to New York, then to London for a year, then back. I lived out of a suitcase, my only real home the cold blue glow of a trading screen. I had no friends, no relationships. Love was a liability I couldn't afford. My singular focus was Dalton Industries. Every night, after a 16-hour workday of dismantling other people's companies, I would open a private, encrypted file on my laptop. It was my real work. I tracked every move Dalton Industries made. I analyzed their quarterly earnings, their stock fluctuations, their executive hires and fires. I knew the name of every board member, their professional histories, and their personal weaknesses. I knew that Richard, in his arrogance, had packed the board with aging cronies who were loyal but lazy. I knew their R&D department had been gutted to fund the massive marketing push for Teraflex, leaving them with no pipeline for future innovation. He had stolen my one great idea, and now he was coasting on it, letting the rest of the empire slowly rust. My first failed attempt at revenge was small, almost pathetic. Using my expertise, I identified a key supplier to Dalton Industries that was severely over-leveraged. I anonymously shorted their stock, hoping to cause a supply chain disruption that would hurt Dalton's bottom line. The stock dipped, but Richard, with his deep pockets, simply bailed the supplier out, acquiring them for pennies on the dollar and further vertically integrating his empire. He turned my attack into a victory for himself. The news report of the acquisition felt like a personal slap in the face. I had underestimated his power, his ability to absorb blows. It was a painful, humbling lesson. A direct assault wouldn't work. I couldn't be a sniper. I had to be a virus. The doubt crept in during those long, lonely nights in unfamiliar cities. Was I chasing a fantasy? Was I wasting my life, fueled by a decade-old wound, while he slept soundly in his mansion. There were moments when the sheer scale of his empire felt insurmountable. I was one woman, a ghost with a laptop. He was a king on a throne. Sometimes the weight of it all was crushing, and the temptation to just let it go, to try and build a normal life, was almost overwhelming. But then I would see his face in an interview, smug and self-satisfied, talking about his vision. And the cold, hard rage would crystallize in my gut all over again, chasing away the doubt. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about balance. It was about the fundamental injustice of a world where takers like him always won. My reputation in the finance world was growing. I was no longer Arthur Vance's protégé. I was known as a turnaround specialist, the quiet woman you brought in when you needed to know exactly where the bones were buried in a company. My work was clean, precise, and utterly ruthless. I had earned the trust of some very powerful people, people who managed billions of dollars in institutional funds. They didn't know about my obsession. They just saw my track record. They saw that I made them money. And that was the only form of trust that truly mattered in this world. After 8 years away, I finally felt ready. I had the knowledge. I had the capital, a small fortune I had built through aggressive, calculated investments. And most importantly, I had the network. It was time to stop studying the fortress. It was time to start buying the stones. I quit my job with Arthur, telling him I was starting my own consulting firm. He grunted, told me I was making a mistake, but I could see a flicker of respect in his shark-like eyes. I moved back to the city I had fled, the city the Daltons still owned. But I didn't come back as the heartbroken girl who had been cast out. I came back as a ghost, a financial specter with a singular, unyielding purpose. The hunt was about to begin, and the prey had no idea he was even being watched. He was still celebrating a victory from a war he thought he'd won 10 years ago. He had no idea that for me, the first shot was only now being fired. Part 3. Weaving the Web. Returning to the city was like stepping into a time capsule. The skyline had changed, but the towering Dalton Industries logo on the side of their headquarters was a constant, a monument to my humiliation. For a moment, standing on a crowded street looking up at it, the old powerless feeling threatened to surface. The feeling of being small, insignificant, an ant at the foot of a mountain. But then I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and felt the cool, hard weight of my new reality. I wasn't an ant anymore. I was a geologist, and I was here to study the mountain's fault lines before I brought it down. The first step was anonymity. Emmy was dead. In her place was a web of shell corporations and holding companies, each with a bland, forgettable name: Apex Holdings, Summit Logistics, North Star Ventures. They were registered in Delaware, in the Cayman Islands, in any jurisdiction that valued privacy. I was a ghost in the machine, a series of routing numbers and legal charters. To the outside world, these were just a handful of disconnected, minor investment firms. But to me, they were the fingers of my invisible hand. The first purchase was terrifying. Through Apex Holdings, I bought a small, insignificant block of Dalton Industries stock. It was barely a rounding error on their total market cap, but to me, it felt like planting a flag on enemy soil. I watched the trade execute on my screen, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing happened. No alarms went off. No one noticed. I was just another nameless, faceless transaction in a sea of billions. The feeling was intoxicating. I had touched my enemy, and he hadn't even flinched. For the next year, this was my life. I operated out of a sterile, minimalist apartment that overlooked the financial district. My days were a meticulous, painstaking routine. I would wake before the markets opened, scan global news, and then begin my quiet assault. I bought shares in small, erratic bursts, never enough at once to trigger a reporting threshold or alert the company's investor relations department. I used different brokers, different companies, different times of day. It was a slow, agonizingly patient process. I was building a position with the subtlety of a rising tide, not a tidal wave. Richard was watching for tidal waves. He would never notice the water level slowly creeping up around his ankles. My internal monologue during this time was a constant, humming calculation. Buy on the dip after the Q2 earnings miss. Sell a fraction through Northstar to create the illusion of a scattered retail investor base. Use Summit to acquire shares from that retiring fund manager in Boston. Every move was a chess piece. I wasn't just buying a company, I was telling a story, a false narrative of random, disconnected market activity that concealed the single, predatory intelligence behind it all. The real turning point came when I began leveraging my network. Revenge, I learned, is rarely a solo endeavor. You need allies, whether they know they're your allies or not. My first target was a man named Julian Croft, a fund manager for a massive state pension fund. I knew from my research that he held a significant, long-term position in Dalton Industries, and I knew from my time in the industry that he was growing increasingly frustrated with Richard's leadership. Dalton's stock had been stagnant for years. Richard was happy to coast on the profits from Terraflex, paying himself a handsome dividend while investing next to nothing in new technology or market expansion. He was milking the company dry. I arranged a meeting with Julian under the guise of my consulting firm, proposing a general analysis of his portfolio's underperforming assets. Of course, I steered the conversation toward Dalton Industries. It's dead money, he grumbled, stirring his espresso in a high-end coffee shop. Richard's a legend, but he's become complacent. He's running it like a personal piggy bank. The board is asleep at the wheel. The board is his collection of golf buddies, I said coolly. They rubber stamp whatever he puts in front of them. What the company needs is an activist investor to shake things up. Someone to force a vote, demand a new strategy. Julian snorted. Easier said than done. Richard controls a huge voting bloc through his family and loyalists. You'd need a significant coalition to even get his attention. How significant? I asked, my voice calm, betraying none of the frantic energy coursing through me. He did a quick calculation on a napkin. 20, maybe 25%, just to force a serious conversation. And what if a coalition like that could be quietly assembled? I leaned forward slightly. A group of investors who believe the company is undervalued and poorly managed, who could pool their voting power to demand a change in leadership and strategy? His eyes narrowed, studying me. He didn't see the vengeful ex-girlfriend. He saw a sharp, hungry strategist who was speaking his language. If you can build it, he said slowly, I'd be willing to listen. My fiduciary duty is to my pensioners, not to Richard Dalton's ego. That was the crack in the armor I needed. Julian didn't join me outright, but he gave me the key. He told me which other institutional investors were unhappy, who was quietly looking for an exit, who felt disrespected by Richard's dismissive attitude. My next ally was far more personal and far more dangerous to recruit. Her name was Clara Dalton, Richard's niece. I remembered her from my time with Mark, a sharp, intelligent woman who was constantly overlooked by her uncle in favor of his own son. She had a brilliant mind for logistics but had been relegated to a middling role in the company's European division, far from the center of power. I knew she harbored a deep-seated resentment. I flew to Geneva to meet her, a massive risk. If she reported me to Richard, my entire plan would be exposed. We met in a small cafe, far from her office. She was guarded, suspicious. I don't know what this is about, she said, her arms crossed tightly, but I don't play family politics. This isn't about politics, I replied. It's about potential. Your potential and the company's. I've read your reports on supply chain optimization. They're brilliant, and they've been completely ignored by your uncle for 3 years. That got her attention. Her posture softened slightly. I represent a group of concerned shareholders, I said, bending the truth just enough. We believe Dalton Industries is stagnating. We believe it needs new vision, a new strategy. And we believe there are talented people within the company, like you, who are being criminally underutilized. I laid out my case, not with emotion, but with data. I showed her the numbers, the declining R&D spend, the market share they were losing to more agile competitors. I never mentioned my personal history. To her, I was simply a financial professional who saw an opportunity. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. "Insight," I said. "Information. An understanding of where the other disillusioned members of the family stand. Your name will never be mentioned. But when the time comes, we will need every vote we can get. We're offering you a chance to be part of a company that actually values your talent." She was silent for a long time, staring out at the lake. Finally, she gave a single, sharp nod. "He never should have put me in charge of paperclips," she said, a bitter fire in her eyes. "Tell me what you need to know." Clara became my inside source, my ghost within the ghost. She fed me information about internal morale, about which family shareholders were loyalists, and which, like her, were tired of living in Richard's shadow. There were close calls. One afternoon, I got a panicked call from one of my brokers. Dalton Industries' CFO had initiated an inquiry into unusual trading patterns from a cluster of holding companies. My web. For a terrifying 48 hours, I thought I was caught. I had to immediately execute a series of decoy trades, selling off small chunks of shares from some companies while buying with others, making the pattern look even more chaotic and random. It worked. The inquiry was dropped, chalked up to algorithmic trading. But the sweat that drenched my back that night was a cold reminder of how close to the edge I was playing. Over 2 years, through patient acquisition and quiet alliance building, the number grew. 10%, 15, 20. With Julian's pension fund and the block of disillusioned family members Clara helped me secure, we were closing in on 35% of the company's voting shares. It was an astoundingly powerful position, built in total silence. Richard Dalton was oblivious. He was too busy accepting awards, vacationing on his yacht, and basking in the glow of his past success. He saw the daily stock price, but he never bothered to look at the shareholder registry. Why would he? He was the king. His reign was absolute. The final piece fell into place when a massive venture capital fund, known for its aggressive activist campaigns, took a small position in the company. I immediately reached out to their director, a woman as ruthless as my old mentor Arthur. I laid out my entire coalition, my data, and my strategy for a complete leadership overhaul. I showed her our combined voting power. Her eyes lit up. She saw the same thing I did, a bloated, sleeping giant, ripe for the picking. With her fund's 5% stake, we crossed the 40% threshold. We had him. It was time to call the meeting. Using the formal mechanisms of corporate governance, our coalition filed the paperwork to call a special shareholder meeting. The stated purpose: to discuss the strategic direction and leadership of the company. The notice would land on Richard Dalton's desk like a declaration of war from an army he didn't even know existed. He wouldn't know my name yet. He would just see a list of funds and holding companies that had suddenly unified against him. He would be confused, then angry, then panicked. He would scramble to consolidate his own power, calling in favors from his old guard loyalists. But it was too late. The trap was sprung. The pieces were all in place. For 10 years, I had been a ghost. But in 2 weeks in that boardroom, Richard Dalton was finally going to see my face. And he was going to learn that the naive little girl whose future he had stolen had just become the single largest voice in his. Part 4. The Reckoning in the Glass Tower. The 2 weeks leading up to the shareholder meeting were the longest of my life. The silence was over. The moment the notice was filed, Dalton Industries became a battlefield. Financial news outlets buzzed with speculation. Who was behind this coordinated move? Was it a hostile takeover attempt? Richard, predictable in his arrogance, went on the offensive. He issued a press release dismissing the meeting as a transparent ploy by short-sighted activist investors to dismantle a great American company for a quick profit. He portrayed himself as the stalwart guardian of the company's legacy, and us as faceless corporate raiders. He still didn't know it was me. My name was nowhere on the filings, buried beneath layers of corporate anonymity. He was fighting shadows, swinging at ghosts. I watched his blustering media appearances from my apartment, a strange sense of calm settling over me. He was loud, emotional, and reactive. I was quiet, prepared, and in control. The roles had been completely reversed. Clara fed me daily updates from inside the company. The office was in chaos. Richard was furious, holding marathon meetings, screaming at his CFO for not seeing this coming. He was trying to whip votes, calling his cronies on the board and his loyal family members, reminding them of their obligations. But for the first time in his life, his power was not absolute. Our coalition held firm. Julian, the pension fund manager, was a rock, his public statements focusing purely on shareholder value and the need for a forward-looking strategy. The venture capital fund was gleefully fanning the flames, loving the public fight. The night before the meeting, I didn't sleep. I didn't pace or panic. I sat by the window in my darkened apartment, looking at that brilliantly lit Dalton Industries tower. I thought about the 24-year-old girl who had walked out of that building a decade ago, hollowed out and erased. I thought about the years in the wilderness, the brutal hours, the gnawing loneliness, the single-minded obsession that had replaced every other part of my life. Was it worth it? I didn't know yet, but I knew there was no turning back. The day of the meeting, I dressed with meticulous care. Not in a flashy power suit, but in a simple, elegant, dark gray dress. My hair was pulled back. My makeup was minimal. I wanted to look serious, professional, and completely unremarkable. I was not there for drama. I was there for a clinical execution. I arrived at the Dalton Tower and took the private elevator to the top-floor boardroom. The air in the elevator was cold, humming with a tense energy. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a thick, palpable silence. The room was exactly as I had imagined it. A long, gleaming mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows with a god's-eye view of the city, and about 30 stern, anxious faces. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking tired but defiant. His allies were clustered around him. My coalition, Julian, the venture capital director, and a few others, sat opposite, their expressions grim and determined. There was an empty chair. The one designated for the representative of Apex Holdings, the largest single entity in the dissident bloc. That was me. I walked into the room. Every head turned. I saw confusion on most faces. But then I looked at Richard. His eyes scanned me, dismissed me, and then snapped back, a jolt of horrified recognition flashing across his face. His jaw went slack. The color drained from his skin. It was as if he had just seen a ghost walk through the wall. And then I saw Mark. He was sitting at his father's side, a token vice president. He looked older, softer, his face etched with a decade of weak compromises. When he saw me, he looked like he was going to be physically sick. He flinched, his eyes darting away, unable to meet my gaze. I ignored them both. I walked calmly to the empty chair, placed my leather portfolio on the table, and sat down. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent room. "My name is Emmy Clark. I represent the Apex Holdings Group. Shall we begin?" The shock was a physical force in the room. Richard sputtered, trying to speak, but no words came out. One of his loyalist board members, a portly man named Henderson, found his voice first. "Clark? The girl with the packaging idea?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief and condescension. "The woman with the packaging idea," I corrected him smoothly, my eyes locked on Richard. "An idea which has served as this company's sole source of meaningful revenue growth for the past 10 years. Richard finally found his voice, a low, venomous growl. What is this? What is the meaning of this, Emmy? A cheap, theatrical stunt. This is not theater, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, businesslike tone. This is a shareholder meeting, and as the representative for a coalition controlling 42% of the voting stock, I believe it's our turn to speak. For the next hour, I laid out our case. I never raised my voice. I never made it personal. I never once mentioned the word theft or betrayal. I didn't have to. I just used his own numbers against him. I put up charts on the room's display screens. I showed the flatlining stock price, the collapsing R&D budget, the market share being eaten away by competitors who had not only copied Teraflex but improved upon it. I showed the exorbitant executive bonuses, Richard's especially, that were being paid out while the company's core business atrophied. It was a cold, brutal, and undeniable dissection of his failed leadership. I wasn't attacking Richard Dalton the man. I was eviscerating the performance of Richard Dalton the chairman. The world has changed, I said, my gaze sweeping across the faces in the room. This company has not. It has become a monument to a single past success, while the future is being built elsewhere. Our coalition believes in the potential of Dalton Industries. We believe in its people, its history, its infrastructure. But we do not believe in its current leadership. Then I laid out our plan. A new strategy focused on aggressive R&D, an expansion into new sustainable technologies, a leaner corporate structure, and a new leadership model, starting with the immediate removal of the chairman of the board. When I finished, there was a heavy silence. I hadn't come with accusations. I had come with a meticulously researched, undeniably superior business plan. I had reminded everyone in the room, the pension fund managers, the investors, even his own family, that their first duty was to the health of the company, not to the ego of the man at the head of the table. Richard tried to fight back. He blustered about loyalty, about legacy, about how he had built this company with his bare hands. But his words were empty, the desperate rantings of a king who had just realized his castle was made of sand. He looked around the room for support, but the faces that looked back at him were filled with doubt and cold, financial calculus. I had changed the equation. This was no longer about him. It was about their money. The vote was called. It was a swift, brutal, digital affair. A formality. The result appeared on the screen almost instantly. The motion to remove Richard Dalton as chairman passed with a 58% majority. The sound Richard made was small, a choked gasp. All the arrogance, all the power, all the bluster, just vanished. He slumped in his chair, a deflated old man, staring at the screen in utter disbelief. He had been so utterly, comprehensively outmaneuvered. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a moment, as if searching for an explanation. But there was no emotion in my face. It was just business, resolution and reflection. The rest of the meeting was a blur of corporate procedure. A new interim chairman was appointed. My official title became Chief Investment Director, a role we had created that gave me oversight of the company's strategic direction and capital allocation. I was the new power behind the throne. As the meeting adjourned, people filed out, avoiding eye contact with Richard. He remained in his chair, a relic in his own boardroom. Mark walked over to me, his face pale. "Emmy, I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." I looked at him, at the man I had once loved, the man whose weakness had been the catalyst for my entire life's trajectory. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even satisfaction. He was just irrelevant. "I'm sure you are," I said, my voice flat, and walked away. I was the last one to leave the boardroom, besides Richard. As I gathered my portfolio, he finally spoke, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Why?" he asked, not looking at me. "After all these years, why go to all this trouble? for revenge. I paused at the door and looked back at him, sitting alone at the head of the long, empty table he no longer commanded. You told me once that my idea needed the muscle of a real company to succeed, I said. You were right. But you were wrong about what a company is. It's not one person's ego. It's a collection of people and ideas, constantly moving forward. You stopped moving forward, Richard. I'm just here to get things moving again. I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out, the click of the closing door echoing behind me like the final turning of a page. Standing in the elevator, descending from the glass tower, I didn't feel a triumphant surge of vindication. I didn't feel the bitter thrill of victory. What I felt was quiet, a profound, deep quiet. The rage that had been my constant companion for a decade had finally, completely, gone silent. It had been replaced not with happiness or joy, but with the simple, solid feeling of a debt being settled, of balance being restored to the universe. He hadn't been destroyed by a scandal or public humiliation. He was simply made obsolete by a better strategy. He was a dinosaur who never saw the meteor coming. I hadn't taken his company to tear it down. I had taken it to build it into what it should have been all along. The ultimate revenge wasn't his destruction. It was my creation. The greatest injustices often happen in quiet rooms, behind closed doors. But the most profound victories can be built in the same way, patiently, quietly, and with unrelenting resolve. This wasn't just a story about getting even. It was a story about becoming even better. If you have a story of your own, about turning betrayal into your greatest motivation, share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, served cold.